Hello, everybody. Welcome to my podcast. In this episode, I am interviewing Steve Weidenkopf on his new book, Canceled 12 Catholic Heroes That History Turned into Villains. So, to give a little introduction to him, Steve is a lecturer in church history at the Graduate School of Theology at Christendom College in Virginia. He's the author of several books that explore and defend the history of the Catholic Church, especially in response to the distortions often presented by modern secular critics. And as I just mentioned, he just recently published this new book, and it is super accessible, super amazing so far from everything that I've read. So I just wanted to talk with him about some popular topics in relation to his book that I hear a lot from you guys on my channel. So thank you so much for being here, Steve. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, for having me on the show. Glad to be here.
So I just wanted to kind of start off asking, what was your inspiration for writing this book? Because obviously you've written a few different books on just Catholic history in general. So what was your inspiration for having a focus on particular figures throughout church history and not just events?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, especially the 12, individuals I mentioned and cover in the book, these are people who throughout my time and my studies in academia as an undergraduate and in grad school even, and then just giving talks around parishes throughout the country, you get people always will bring up certain Catholic figures. And in our perspective in modern day, most of our history, especially in the United States and the English-speaking world, has been presented from an English Protestant perspective. That's kind of the main narrative that's been taught in most schools. Again, it depends on where you go to school, but generally speaking, right, that's the kind of general narrative. And so people like Mary Tudor, for example, has been maligned throughout history as quote-unquote Bloody Mary. Guy Fawkes has also been given kind of a bad name, if you will, at least in English areas. And then other people as well, the Crusaders and Templars and others that I mentioned in the book, have been presented from this really negative light. And so I wanted to write a book that put these people, these individuals, in the proper historical context, first of all, and helped not only non-Catholics, but especially Catholics, know the Catholic story of who these individuals are. Because even Catholics are susceptible to seeing these individuals, Marie Antoinette, for example, through very secular or anti-Catholic or very Protestant, if not outright anti-Catholic, at least just from a very specific perspective, and they don't understand the Catholic story of who these individuals were. And everyone I cover in the book were people, men and women, who loved God, who loved the church, who lived their faith as authentically as they could in the historical circumstances in which they lived. None of them are saints that I cover, so we're not looking at people who lived, overly heroic virtue. They did good things and bad things. They were men and women of free will just like we are. But their story, I think, has not been told properly from a Catholic perspective, and so that's what I wanted to set out to do in this book.
Yeah, that's great. I find that so interesting because a little background about me, I was raised in the public school system in Southern California, and even though my history teachers, they were Christian, they were Protestant. And so reading through this book in general, I'm like, oh my goodness, like I did learn this misconception in high school. And I vividly remember having such a negative perspective of Catholic history and such a positive, high perspective of some of these figures you talk about that were Protestant that maybe should not have been exalted as much as they were in my education system. So that's been like a new revelation that I've been discovering as I've gone through your book.
Okay.
So in the introduction, kind of on that note, you discuss how the method for teaching and understanding history drastically changed in the 19th century. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit for people who've never heard that before?
Yeah, sure. So to not get too boring or technical in terms of how history was taught in the past and how academia views history and the historical sciences. The first thing I always try to mention to people is that history as an independent subject really wasn't taught, right, up until the 19th century. It was taught, but it wasn't taught as its own independent separate subject. Instead, it was usually taught as a part of literature. Because people in centuries past, especially the ancient world, and even throughout the medieval world, saw history as how they taught, how they learned it, how they presented it as a form of literature. Not that it means that it was fiction, and completely made up, but it's literature. It's the telling of a story of a people, right, or a group of people or a nation. That's what history was, and it was taught in a narrative perspective, in a story way. And when you think about it, that's actually very pedagogically correct in terms of, at least from a Christian's perspective, right, because that's how Jesus taught. You look at how he interacted with the apostles, and even sometimes, larger group of disciples, he was more specific in his teaching, let's say. But when he taught the crowds, large groups of people, he taught in stories. We call them parables, right? He taught in story. And so why did he teach that way? Why would, God incarnate come and use that pedagogical approach for most people? It's a good question for us to ask. And so I think that one of the reasons why he did that is because we are people who are oriented towards story. We're relational. And so we, just like God is relational, and so we relate to stories, and we remember, even more importantly, we remember stories, right? So if, we sit down and have a great conversation with a friend or a relative or whoever, we're going to remember various stories that they told, or they tell us, especially if they're humorous or if there's some kind of dramatic event to them. We'll remember those, and we'll remember even the details. We might even remember where we were when the person told the story or whatever, right? Whereas if we're just giving data or information, for example, outside of the context of a narrative or a story, we might remember some of it, but we're going to struggle more and we're going to have to work harder to remember that than if it's presented to us in a narrative format. So anyway, so that's how history was taught up until about the 19th century. Then you have the creation in Prussia of the University of Berlin, and you have these 18th or 19th century German historians who come and look at the subject, especially Leopold von Ranke is this German historian in particular, who in the 19th century tries to change history into a subject that's more quote-unquote scientific. And so he begins to focus more on documents and manuscripts. Not that these weren't looked at in the past, but that becomes the focus. And so for him, history turned into something that was more the historian's job was to look at different documents and various sources and try to determine what the true story was, if you will, through this contextual criticism of the documents. And so history then gradually became less and less about telling stories and about recounting the narrative of peoples and nations and events, and instead became this, overly quote-unquote scientific academic focus on different documents and asking questions like, why did this particular author write? Who was he writing for? When did he write? Now, none of that is bad, right? So from my perspective, especially in academia, it's a both and. You need to have both. You need to have the narrative understanding of telling story or teaching history in a narrative way, but you also have to rely on, as appropriate, textual criticism and other kinds of historical documents and manuscripts. I think it's a both and either or. But with von Ranke, what happens in the 19th century is the subject becomes more and more focused on documents and, analyzing these documents and asking questions about the documents, which in and of itself is limited, frankly, because not many documents survive, and in many centuries there are not very many documents from these centuries, so it's kind of hard to craft a narrative from that or craft an understanding of what happened during those centuries from the few manuscripts that exist. And it can also really taint your understanding of that century or that, because you're only looking at the documents you have available. So that's what I mean by that history really kind of changed. And so now in the modern age, it's very rare to see, we're still kind of influenced by von Ranke's historical scientific approach, and we're, as the predominant method of pedagogy. And so many people think history is boring. They don't want to learn history. They, for them, it's names, dates, and events, and I just have to memorize this in order to pass a test, and once I pass the test, I forget everything. And names and dates and events obviously are important in history, but if you're taught those things in the context of a narrative, then in a story with drama, with heroes, with villains, with you using those terms, you're more apt to remember these events, and it will have more meaning for you as a person because you'll have a more relational, you'll have a more relational aspect to that information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's great. I definitely see in my generation of people in education how there's this huge draw towards the analytic subjects of math and, the STEM subjects, of course. And there's a lot of people who, in general, history, of course, and English, and like you said, those oftentimes, and they historically went hand in hand, they don't see any value in it because they want something that's clear-cut and objective. They want the answer. They want something very calculated. And because of that, they can view history from a lens of like, that's all it is. We have all the answers. We know everything. What's been written is said and done, and there's no need to discuss further how this perspective might be valid now because we already know we already know Bloody Mary. We already know her history and how she was horrible to many Protestants in her country. So why should we further talk about it?
Right.
So I love how you started the book off with that. That was so fascinating. Okay, so being a younger person kind of on the front lines of defending the faith and apologetics, there's some historical topics that are consistently brought up. It's like these people are in a secret club where they all kind of give each other information, and then they have the same one-liners that they present to Catholics online. And so some of these topics, I mean, all of these topics actually you address in this book, which is wonderful. So kind of the three main ones I wanted to discuss were the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and the exploration and conquest of the Americas. So you discuss these topics in your book, and you provide some key figures that have been villainized during these historical periods and events. And I would love to go through some of these topics, and you can give us some background information on what actually happened, and then bring up one or few of the key figures that you mentioned in this text about how they were villainized and why that account is actually not accurate. So maybe we could start with the Crusades.
Sure. Yeah. How much time do we have? No.
Right?
It's a big. I teach an entire semester-long academic course on the Crusades, so it's a big subject, a big topic.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and your experience is not dissimilar, frankly, from mine when I go out and give talks and talk to people about those are always the historical events that come up, especially with non-Catholics, Catholics. But even within the context of the Church itself, there are many Catholics who just grossly misunderstand these historical events. So first, I mean, the first thing, kind of the overarching concept that people need to keep in mind when we talk about whatever subject it is, or whatever person it is that it's necessary to understand the historical context in which these events and these people live. And I say this over and over again, and I'm a broken record with it, but it needs to be said. And so any kind of my advice to anybody who's engaging in these apologetical kind of conversations with people is to start off with that. No matter what the person says, no matter what jugular they go for, no matter what holy hand grenade of Antioch they throw on the table, if you will, to get you off your game, is to just say, well, let's take a step back and understand the proper historical context, right? It's not a justification for what happened or whatever. It helps to explain what happened, right? So, and one of the things we have to do, which you just mentioned a minute ago about modernism or people living in the modern age, is that we tend to have this kind of arrogant attitude about the past and about past centuries, about past people, that is, like we read backwards into history, is what Hilaire Belloc called it, meaning that, we judge the past from a supposed position of superiority. And so we look back at people and we think, oh, well, they're just dumb or stupid or ignorant or zealous or, whatever, and they didn't have science, so that's why they did these things, without realizing that, the only difference between the people who lived before us and us is time and technology. That's, human beings are human beings, and we've been that way for thousands of years. So with all that background, right? So that's the context of the context. So for the Crusades, it's, there are many different myths associated with the Crusades, and I address most of the major ones in a different book, The Glory of the Crusades, I wrote for Catholic Answers now 11 years ago. And that in there, you look at certain things, like many of the myths will come up. People will say, well, the Crusaders went out of greed. They wanted money, they wanted land. I mean, even as an undergraduate, I was taught this notion that what you had happen in the 11th century in Europe was this population boom, this explosion of the population. So you had a lot of second, third, fourth born sons in these European families that, because of the so-called right of primogeniture, which only the firstborn son inherits all the land, the second, third, fourth born sons didn't have land, so they fought with each other. And so because you had all those Christians infighting, the church decided this was bad, and to stop it, they marshaled everybody to go over to the Holy Land and take over land from the Muslims. I mean, that was the predominant kind of concept and narrative to answer the question why the Crusades started. And all of that fell apart, thankfully, through the work and the scholarly work of Jonathan Riley Smith, a British historian who was a specific Crusade historian. And he did research, especially in France, and saw that for the most part, especially on the First Crusade, it wasn't the second, third, and fourth-born sons who went on crusade. It was the firstborn sons who went. The ones who stood the most to lose were the ones who went on crusade. And then he began to ask the question, well, why? And then he dug deeper into the documents and found that, for the most part, these French families recognized that what the Pope was asking them to do here in the late 11th century was so unique, so valuable, so important, that they had to send their most important member of the family on crusade. And then the second, third, and fourth-born sons went with them in many cases, so they had their brothers with them. But it wasn't just, you guys go and the most important person stays home. And plus, that's another concept or another notion on this is that primogeniture is wasn't widespread throughout Europe. It was only in certain feudal areas, in certain areas of Europe, and it wasn't the case, especially in France or in other places. It was really predominant in England and other areas, but that's a whole other matter to get into. But people think that, right? Because we see movies and we see the whole, only the firstborn son gets it, and so that's why they all went and fought, but that's not true. So most of them were not motivated by greed, right? To kind of cover the general concept, most crusaders, those who participated in these events, went because out of love, to be honest with you. It's a simple question, or the simple answer. They loved God. They loved their neighbor, they loved themselves in terms of their salvation. And so this was a unique event. They saw that the Crusades for them were armed pilgrimages. And why it's important is about being armed is that previously in the medieval world, if you went on a pilgrimage, you couldn't take your weapons if you were a nobleman. So, again, put yourself in the historical context. We're dealing with a society where, a nobleman and his sons, if you will, are the military, they're the police force, they're the law enforcement, their safety, they're all of that wrapped up together. And so for them, their weapons were an integral part of who they were. So to put those aside and go on a pilgrimage was a significant deal, so many of them didn't do it. So along comes Pope Urban II in 1095. He preaches the crusade at the local council of Clermont and marshals these warriors to go to the Holy Land to liberate the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. That was the objective of the First Crusade, and all the Crusades, really, most of them at least, to the Holy Land in North Africa. And then then he grants the spiritual indulgence, the spiritual privilege of the indulgence, which was again a unique thing for them to participate and to receive, especially with their weapons. And so this armed pilgrimage was something that they overwhelmingly joined and went and participated in. And they again saw what they were doing as a penitential exercise to liberate the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from the hands of Islam, in the hands of Muslim forces at the time.
Do you mind if I
go ahead? No, interject.
Really quick?
Please.
So I was going to ask to play devil's advocate. I could see people saying, "Well, why did they have to liberate the Holy Land? Yeah. Why not just let the Muslims have it?"
Right. So from a pluralistic society perspective in the modern world, that makes complete sense to us, right? And from a religiously indifferent society in many ways, that makes complete sense to us. But again, context, medieval people were very religious people. I'm not saying everybody was a saint who lived in the Middle Ages, because that's not true, obviously, but they were imbued with a sense of faith, and the faith was very important to them, and it was an integral aspect of their society. And so for the Holy Land, which they considered to be Christ's patrimony, his land, for it to be in the hands of anyone other than Christians, if you will, was seen as just something that should be rectified. And again, these crusades started mostly because the Eastern Roman Emperor, we call them the Byzantines, had been attacked by the Seljuk Turks and others, and they had lost a significant portion of their empire in what is now modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, Anatolia at the time. And so the Eastern Emperor sent envoys to the West asking the Pope to marshal warriors and send them to the East to help him to recover these lands. So this was a response to harassment by the Seljuks towards indigenous Christians and indigenous Jewish people living in the Holy Land who were being harassed and persecuted. Western pilgrims leaving Europe and going to the Holy Land sites, which they had been doing since the 4th century, being harassed and persecuted, and then the Eastern Emperor asking for help. So all that kind of together coalesces in the 11th century as to why they went.
Okay, yep, that makes a lot of sense. And so in regard to the later Crusades, I know you kind of get into that in your text here. Could you maybe say a few words about that? What were the motives, and maybe what were some things that weren't ideal, that didn't go as ideally as maybe they should have?
Sure. Yeah. So in the book in particular, I talk about the Templars. So they're the group of people I focus on most in the book, in terms of a group of Catholics who have been maligned and canceled in history and used for nefarious means to attack the church by certain enemies of the church, especially Enlightenment thinkers. So the Templars were a military religious order that grew up as a result of the success of the First Crusade. So the First Crusade liberated Jerusalem in 1099. This was the only really fully successful crusade. So again, this was an armed pilgrimage, so those who were left, many of them, they'd completed their pilgrimage, they had liberated the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It was now time to go home. Just like you and I go on a pilgrimage to Rome or Jerusalem, we don't stay, although we might want to, we go back home, right? So same thing for them. They went back to Europe. There were about 2,000 or so warriors left who decided to stay. They had liberated about 600 miles worth of territory, and they needed to defend it. And so they stayed, but it wasn't enough of them to defend the 600-mile frontier. So what organically kind of grew out of that need was these military religious orders. So these are warrior monks, men who live the evangelical counsels of chastity, poverty, and obedience in an order, but also pledged to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land and to protect the holy sites and to protect this liberated Christian territory. And the Templars were one of a multitude of different groups that developed in this period of time, known as the Templars because the original barracks was up on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And so they became a very important order throughout history and in time because they gained members, and noble families in Europe would give them land, and so they became wealthy. They also established the first kind of international banking ATM system, if you will. So what would happen is, if you're a pilgrim leaving Western Europe, leaving France, going to Jerusalem, you don't want to take a lot of coin or a lot of cash with you, any gold or things, right? Because you're liable to be robbed and lose that. So what you would do is you go to a Templar house, let's say in Paris, you deposit your coin, you get a deposit slip from the Templars there that says, Emily deposited 500 gold florins here, at the Templar house in Paris. So you take that deposit slip, you go to Jerusalem, you go to the Templar house there, you give it to them, they give you your money back minus a fee, right? So the Templars would take a little bit off the top, a little ATM surcharge fee, and they became very wealthy as a result of that, frankly. And so fast forward to the 14th century, King Philip IV in France is upset with them for a multitude of different reasons, mostly because of their wealth. He has eyes on that and basically concocts this whole story that they were anti-Christians, that they participated in these weird rituals, that they, didn't obey their vow, all these kinds of nefarious things, that they spat on crucifixes, all this horrible stuff. And so he had them arrested, which was illegal because they were under the church and not under royal authority. Anyways, long story short, eventually they were suppressed in the 14th century at the Ecumenical Council of Vienne in France, and the order goes out of existence. But because of that, and because of their kind of somewhat secretive nature, and because of their influence and wealth and power and many stories associated with them, over time through the centuries, various myths grew up about them, so they became the subject of all kinds of Hollywood movies and stories. Dan Brown used them as a major character in his Da Vinci Code book, and the protectors of the secret marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene and that kind of nonsense. But they're an easy group to use that because they had this kind of unique and interesting history, and then they're not around anymore. So it's easy to there's no one left to defend them except for Catholic historians like me, and others who are interested in the Crusades. So there you go. Yeah.
You're on the front lines.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, I think that ties into kind of the inquisitors during the Spanish Inquisition. I think that they kind of share a similar fate of being mocked and mischaracterized in films and books and other sort of media. So maybe you could give some background information on what the Spanish Inquisition was, and then who were the inquisitors.
Sure. Yeah. So again, a large subject, and difficult to kind of condense into a certain sense. But a couple of things to keep in mind with the inquisitors and Spanish Inquisition. So the first aspect is to understand that they're two different things, right? So the Inquisition as this kind of way in which to investigate heresy, if you will, really grew up in the 13th century. So there was a heresy that erupted in the south of France in the 13th century known as Catharism or Albigensianism, it's also known as. It was a dualistic heresy where the Gnostic type of heresy as well. They believed that material things were bad, spiritual things were good, and so in general there were many other things they believed. But this heresy grew rapidly in the south of France, and so popes at the time decided that they need, especially Pope Innocent III, who I addressed in the book, and then later popes after him, create what's known as the medieval inquisitors. And these were men who were itinerant, who went to areas where heresy had erupted. They preached the truth, and then they investigated heresy and allowed people to come before them, answer questions, and to repent, and give them opportunities to repent and to rejoin communion within the church. And if not, if they were obstinate in their heresy and persisted in their heresy over time, they would then be remanded to the secular authorities, where the secular authorities dealt with them. So the thing to always keep in mind, whether you're talking the medieval inquisitors or the Spanish inquisitors, is that in this context, in medieval Europe and in later 15th century Spain, heresy was not only just an ecclesiastical or church crime, was also a secular crime. This, for me, is the biggest issue and problem and mistake, really, that people misunderstand or don't appreciate or don't know in the modern age when we talk about this topic in particular, right? So it's crucial to understand that distinction or that perspective. And it's hard for us to understand that because we live, especially as Americans, we live in a pluralistic society where we and our government doesn't make, if you will, is not supposed to at least, any kind of statement about favoring one religion over another or any religion at all, religion. So we grew up in that, we understand that system, we've lived in that, but if you look at the history of the world, frankly, the United States and kind of now more Western perspective on religion and society and government is extremely rare in human history, right? Most human civilizations for 90+% of human history have not operated that way. But we operate that way, so we think everything, we look back in history and think, oh, they should have acted like we do, but we don't appreciate the historical context. So for medieval Europeans, right, again, their faith was integral to their life. And for them, it would be impossible to think that, someone who preached a teaching different than what the church taught in terms of Catholic doctrine would be acceptable and would be something that you can allow in society, right? It just was inconceivable, if you will, to them, to use that word, just completely not in their worldview. So for them, not only wasn't in the worldview, but the heretic was seen actually, or somebody who preached false teaching was seen as a person who was a threat to secular society, was a threat to peace and unity and community in society. And that's not just some kind of bigoted response by secular authority at the time. History proves, and proved then, and they knew that heresy brings violence. Sometimes that's the heretics or the heresy itself producing violence, but more often than not, it was people persecuting and attacking the heretic and, taking kind of matters into their own hands, if you will, to rid society of the heretic. And so in order to protect the heretic as a matter of charity, the church instituted these investigative tribunals, later known as Inquisitions, or these itinerant preachers, Dominicans usually, known as medieval inquisitors, to investigate it in a charitable way and to either prove or disprove whether this person actually believed in heresy and give them an opportunity to recant. And then the state would have to step in if they were obstinate, and then because heresy was seen as such a threat to society and the community in the secular world, the punishment for heresy was death. And so then that's when, heretics were burned at the stake. So the church never did that. The church was, actually by canon law, it was illegal to give a sentence of death. You couldn't give a death penalty under ecclesiastical law and ecclesiastical judges and trials. And so that's why the state did it. Now that's the other part, the other distinction that people don't realize today is that there were two separate legal systems, right? There's a church legal system, or an ecclesial legal system, and then there was a secular legal system. And it still exists today, but the church's legal system is not as prevalent in certain things as it used to be in centuries past. But we still have a canon law and a church law that governs things within the church, and that's separate from secular law. So those are the contexts that you need. And Spain's a whole different matter because you get to the 15th century, Spain is a unique area where you have Muslims and Jews living alongside Christians, and you have Spanish Christian society was set up and established such that, Jewish people and Muslims could only do certain things. They couldn't advance in society. It was a very segregated and a very stratified society. And then you had many Jews and Christians, Jews and Muslims who would convert to the faith. But then there was this kind of conspiracy theory that began to erupt in the late 15th century that, those who converted, especially newer converts from Judaism or Islam, were not authentically Christian, that they were outwardly saying they were Christian, but inwardly and privately they were still practicing their Jewish or their Muslim faith. And so there were some elements in Spanish society that thought, well, this is a threat because, Spanish society had just liberated our entire nation, or a kingdom, if you will, 92, with the last Muslim stronghold in Granada falling. And this was culminating in an 800-year war, basically, that required Spanish Christians to liberate Spain from Muslim influence. And so there were many elements of Spanish society that were concerned that, if we don't deal with this, there's this kind of hidden fifth element, if you will, that might come into play and welcome a Muslim army from North Africa again, and we have to go through this whole century-long conflict. We don't want that. So there was heightened tensions there. There were many old Christian families in Spain that were jealous of some of these new conversos, they were called, newer Christians who kind of advanced rapidly up through Spanish society. So there was jealousy involved in there. And the biggest difference with the Spanish Inquisition is it was something that was actually controlled by the Spanish crown. So King Fernando and Queen Isabel asked the Pope to grant them authority to have an Inquisition in Spain. He granted it, and so the Inquisitors really fell under royal control rather than ecclesial control, and it really became an organ of state. And so many of the things that the people hear about as being problematic occurred during the Spanish Inquisition, but there are many falsities that are still attributed even to the Spanish Inquisition. Things like tens of thousands or millions of people dying, no accurate historical records that prove that whatsoever, or that witches were burned en masse in Spain. Actually, more witches were burned in Protestant countries than Catholic countries, especially in Spain. And this was not something the Inquisition really dealt with, or that the Inquisition was some kind of monolithic, all-encompassing, omniscient, omnipotent organization that suppressed free thought around the world. Never did that. In fact, there were no more than 40 inquisitors in Spain at any one time, so there's no way that they could have controlled the world with that less people.
So if somebody was a self-proclaimed Muslim, the Inquisition was not targeting them in any capacity. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. So that's a great point, right? Inquisitors, whether medieval or Spanish inquisitors or other inquisitors, even in Rome, there is a Roman Inquisition. Only dealt with heresy, right? And heresy is a post-baptismal obstinate denial of faith. You have to be baptized, be a Christian, and then say you don't believe what the church teaches, you present a false teaching or a false doctrine, to be considered a heretic. So if you're a Jew, a Muslim, or any other faith, if you will, not under the control of or under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clarifying that. So let's get to the exploration and conquest of the Americas. So Christopher Columbus, very controversial figure, especially recently in the United States. So maybe you could give some background on him and in general the conquistadors, what actually happened when they were exploring the New World.
Sure. Yeah. So Christopher Columbus has become this symbol of everything that's wrong with Western society. Apparently, for some reason, I'm not exactly certain how that kind of happened, but there is. A lot of it happens because of this false narrative that's presented of him that he was a man who was a genocidal maniac, bent on coming to the New World to conquer, to look for gold, to just bring up all kinds of atrocities to the people in the New World. And so a lot of what people miss, so Columbus, just off the top, right, is not a saint. He wasn't a man he was a man of faith. He was a man of deep faith. He was a man of deep and authentic piety. But he was a man, right? And so he had free will. He exercised it both poorly and in good ways, and he exercised his judgment that way as well, sometimes poorly, sometimes well. He was a great navigator, great sailor, a daring man, a courageous man, a horrible administrator, and a bad organizer, and not someone who should have been given control of vast new territories to govern. Not somebody who had those skills at all. And that got him into trouble, and that leads to many of the problems that happen in the New World, which then leads to kind of his modern day accusations against him and this kind of canceling of him, if you will. But Columbus was a man, again, who I think most people focus on what he did or try to think about, and not only do they focus specifically on what Columbus did, but then they kind of draw this conclusion of here's all the things that happened to people in the New World after Columbus came, and they pin it all on Columbus. Like he's guilty for everything that happened in the centuries afterwards, which is kind of nonsensical when you think about it. It's hard. You can't pin everything that happens or that individual decisions that are made in centuries past on one particular person, right? I think that's just, especially when it was unintended consequences. We can talk about it, but to malign him and to cancel him for things that he had no control over in centuries after he was dead is again not. It's uncharitable, first of all, and not historically accurate. But so most people think of Columbus of what he did. What they don't focus on, though, and this is what I try to highlight in the book, is they don't ask the question of why. Why did he go? Now, it wasn't the first person necessarily who thought, oh, maybe there's a better way to get to the east and get to the spices. Other people thought it. Nobody was daring enough to do it. He was. And even then, he had to fight through to get permission from, the Spanish crown, from Isabel, to be able to do it. She set up, when he first came to her and asked, presented his proposal to do it, she referred the matter to a commission of her experts and her, scientists and mathematicians and sailors. And their recommendation back to her was, don't support him because he's crazy. His calculations calculation for how big the ocean is wrong. He thought he could get to the New World in a couple of weeks, if you will, or to the east rather, in a couple of weeks or a month. And they said that he miscalculated the ocean's scale, if you will, by thousands of miles. And so they estimated it would take him months to get to where he thought he was going to go. That ultimately not ended up being true either because of the winds and how he was able to do it. But still, there was debate about that, right? No debate about whether the Earth was flat. Nobody believed that at the time. Everybody believed that the Earth was round. That's a whole nother modern 19th century misconception of that whole situation. But that's a tangent. So why did he go, right? He went because he had great faith, and he was very focused, right, wrong, and different. This is just who he was. He was very much focused on the end time, on Christ coming again. And he was very focused, as many people have been throughout Catholic history and Christian history, that there are certain things needed to happen before Christ could come again, right? When he thought that one of those things that he believed, and people at the time believed, was that Jerusalem, going back to the Crusades, that Jerusalem needed to be under Christian control. So at this time in the 15th century, it was not. It was thoroughly under Muslim control. And so he believed that what he could accomplish, or one of the things he could try to accomplish, by getting a faster route to the east, by establishing faster and quicker trade routes, he could bring spices back to the New World and, generate more revenue for the crown and for himself. He would then utilize those proceeds to finance a new expedition, to a new crusade, to go and to liberate Jerusalem. And that was his focus. Right. And again, we can debate whether that's good, bad, and different, whether you agree with that or not, whatever. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what he wanted. He was very, very, very specific about that. That's what his goal was. His goal was not to go to the New World and subjugate or enslave any peoples that he found there. His goal was not to, create this, this genocide that would wipe out new people that he met, right? It wasn't even necessarily solely about gold. It was about taking the proceeds of the wealth of the land, especially if he thought it was going to be spices, and bring it back to the New World. And from that trade, then he would be able to receive the finances he needed to help finance this crusade, this expedition, and encourage the Spanish crown to undertake it. So that's why he went. He came to the New World. He met the New World people, indigenous people here. Many of them were very friendly to him. He treated them very friendly. He gave commands to his sailors when he left to go back to the New World, back to Spain, rather, the Old World, to treat the peoples fairly and charitably. And when he returned, he found they didn't. He punished his sailors for not following his orders. But quickly, again, he had no real skills as an administrator, so things kind of got out of hand, and the crown had to take over. He was even sent back to the Old World in chains at one point because of how his mismanagement of certain things, and plus had political enemies himself among the various Spanish colonists. So that's Columbus, right? I think Columbus is just, there's too much that's placed on Columbus's shoulders because he's just an easy guy to do that to. He's one specific individual who's well known, who many people, including Italian Americans, the 19th century kind of adopted as their, hero, and, got Congress to recognize him with a nice federal holiday in October. And so, but now we have to decide whether we should have Columbus Day, whether it's Indigenous Peoples Day, whatever day it is. Regardless, right, what he did was quite impressive. It was courageous. He did discover a place that, the indigenous people living here didn't know that there were people in the quote-unquote Old World. People in the Old World, if you will, quote-unquote, didn't know that there were people in this part of the world, right? So he at least ushered in this contact, if you will, between these two different groups of peoples. And then, so later on, you have, Spanish colonization efforts, you have English colonization efforts, even French colonization efforts in this new world. And there's a mixed history of baggage there. I think the overarching thing just to say here is that more often than not, people who criticize the church for these things that happened in the new world think that the church was responsible for it, right? Or Christians are responsible for it, without realizing that you really have to take a distinction and look at that there is colonial authorities and colonists, and then there were who were bent on economic gain and bent on subjugating the New World's people, and then there was the church and missionaries, and they were frequently, the two of them, at odds. Those two camps, if you will, among the European nations were at odds with each other about how to handle things and how to do things in the New World. So was there abuse here by Europeans against indigenous peoples? Oh, absolutely. Some unintended consequences, the bringing of diseases, which the Europeans had no idea would impact the indigenous people's immunity or lack of immunity in this world and cause widespread death? No, I mean, they didn't intend that. Did it happen? Yeah. Is that a bad thing? Sure, absolutely, but not intended. Was there slavery here? Yes. Was slavery in keeping with the church's teachings? 100% not. right? Popes going all the way back to, the 15th century had consistently and constantly condemned the slave trade, the slave of indigenous peoples, the enslavement of Africans, completely condemned. Did European colonists listen to the Pope and the Church? No. Do Catholics today, 100%, people who call themselves Catholics, do they 100% listen to, the Church and live out their faith authentically all the time? No. We're sinful yet redeemed creatures. And there are people who call themselves Catholic who don't live in accordance with the Church's teachings in many areas, right? So that's the same as it was. Is it true now? It was true then. So these are the contexts, the things which we need to keep in mind when we talk about the New World and, people like Cortez and the conquistadors, and who were motivated by many ways by economic means. But we have to separate that history from the missionary activity that also was sometimes accompanying the conquistadors, but more often than not was a separate endeavor.
Yeah, exactly. And you saying that reminded me of the conversation at the beginning of this episode of people just love to simplify history, and I think they find somebody that they can blame for something, and it's just, that's it. End of conversation, end of story. And that's what happened with Columbus. And it also, this whole conversation with the exploration of the New World, I think so many people don't consider the culture of the indigenous people as well, which at times was not praiseworthy. And if it were the Europeans engaging in some of the acts that the indigenous people were, no one would ever hear the end of it.
Right.
But because people like to simplify things and choose a villain and choose a hero and choose a victim, right, we have this account which is so far from the truth.
Absolutely. And a lot of it is, and to get to the origin of it a little bit, is, a lot of this narrative history that we adopt today, or many people believe today, again, comes to blame everything on the English, really comes to the English and the English Protestant perspective. Because, again, we're dealing here in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries with the height, this is the golden age of Spain. Spain was the empire of the world, the superpower. And so, their sworn enemy was England, along with others, but, France and too. But, England was really their sworn enemy. And so the English really perpetuated this kind of black legend of Spain, this mythology of Spain that says the Spanish were evil, the Spanish, English colonial efforts, we were all great, the English would say, which was not true at all, remotely so. But that's what they, that's the propaganda that was highlighted against the Spanish. And so it's kind of come down into our own modern day, and that's how we see it. And part of that propaganda was this whole kind of, to your point, of this, quote unquote, noble savage kind of mentality that the people in the New World, the indigenous world, were, living this kind of pristine, happy, sweet, beautiful, charitable life. There was no human sacrifice going on. There was no tens of thousands of innocent children being killed every year in what is now Mexico City. None of that ever happened, right? These were all just quiet, nice people until the Europeans came. And that's a gross oversimplification of, right, the historical circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me, I remember reading about, maybe it was in your other book, The Real Story of Catholic History, which, by the way, anyone listening, great book, recommend that one as well. But people thought that Hernan Cortez and some of his men were exaggerating in their accounts of all of the human sacrificing going on in the colonies. And it wasn't until this past century, even just a few decades ago, where archaeologists uncovered thousands and thousands of skulls, bones that they didn't have previously. And so that validated and verified the account that Hernan Cortez gave and his men, which previously people wanted to say,
it's a fable.
Those were his words. Yeah, it's fake. He was just justifying his horrible treatment of them. And then now we have more evidence of it. And it just goes to show history is constantly fluctuating, and your perspective of it being a story, and that's how it was viewed for so long. That's the best way to view it instead of having this objective, strict lens of it.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned that. History is complex, and it's rarely singularly focused, just like human beings, right? That's what history is. It's learning, or going back and looking at the actions of men and women who've come before us, and just like we are complex creatures given free will, which we use either in virtuous ways or non-virtuous ways, true for people in the past. And rarely is someone the sum of one singular bad decision or action that they make, right? That's true for our own lives. It's true for people who come before us. And so we just have to understand the context. And it doesn't mean it doesn't justify what they've done, right? It doesn't make something moral that they did that was immoral, if you will, but to use the extremes. But at least it helps provide a context to explain why things were done the way that they were done, or why decisions were made that they were made.
Yeah, exactly. I think the psychology behind these human beings that we're studying is often forgotten, and instead they've just been reduced to dates, numbers, events, and that's it. Okay, last thing I wanted to mention briefly is you have a whole section in here on the Protestant Reformation, or as you like to refer to it, as the Protestant Revolt or the Revolution. So I'd love to hear your kind of take on that, why you use that language, and anything else maybe you want to mention about how you mentioned at the beginning of this that Protestant history, or history is kind of viewed through a Protestant lens, and how that affects our understanding of the Reformation as a whole. So maybe you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, so, I use the term, and I'm not the only one, but there are other Catholic historians in the past and even now who use the term, Protestant Revolution or Protestant Revolt rather than Reformation. And so, I usually teach my students, and I start off with this, that words matter, and what words we use to define something matters as well. There's a big difference, let's say, especially in the world if you were to say someone is pro-life versus someone being anti-abortion, right? Those seeming on the surface, they can mean the same thing, if you will, but whoever uses those terms can mean very different things about them and approach that subject from two different perspectives. So from a Catholic perspective, looking at history from a Catholic perspective, the Protestant movement, if we want to use that kind of neutral term, in the 16th century was absolutely a revolt. It started out as a theological revolt among Luther's teachings and writings, and then others, Calvin, Zwingli, after him. But then it soon quickly devolved into a political and even economic revolt in a certain sense, right, against authority. And so even Luther himself never styled himself a reformer. Like if you were to, you go through all of Luther's writings, he never said, I'm a reforming the church. He never saw himself that way. He saw what he was doing was, trying to restore, a more, apostolic view of the Christian faith. And Calvin in particular was more focused on that than Luther was. But Luther had definite problems with authority, with the papacy, with the sacramental system of the church, and how he thought all of that, according with his doctrines, kind of enslaved Christians, if you will. And so he was trying to free people from that. But he never saw it as a reform. Were there elements within the church, were there abuses within the Catholic Church at the time that needed to be reformed? Absolutely, 100%. And there were many people before Luther, and throughout the 16th century, and eventually the church finally later in the Council of Trent is able to start that Catholic Reformation process, if you will. So, it wasn't just the abuses, though, that kind of led to his interaction with the church. There were many other issues that he had. The single biggest one was papal authority, to be honest with you. And so many people look at his 95 Theses, for example, which, by the way, he never nailed on the church door at Wittenberg. That's a huge, later myth. He just, he published them in Latin. It was meant to be read. It was not a big, But that's a whole side thing. But another tangent. But, if you read those 95 Theses, a lot of them, there's nothing wrong with what he's saying, right? He's 100% right in this particular case. But about 41 of them, according to Pope Leo X, were wrong and were condemned. But the single biggest thing that he gets into trouble with, many people think it's indulgences or the so-called quote-unquote selling of indulgences. I mean, that was one issue, but that really wasn't the issue. The issue is, if you read the 95 Theses in particular, Luther it says that the Pope has no authority, whatever, to grant indulgences. That's what gets him into trouble. It's an attack on papal authority, and that's a consistent theme throughout his writings, especially in his 1520 treatises, and then later. That's his focus, is he wants to, abolish, if you will, papal authority, or he doesn't view it in the way that apostolically had been viewed. So at the end of the day, right, a revolution is something, or reform, I should say, really seeks to make something or an institution, to return it to its proper state, to a pristine state, to a more pure state, right, to root out corruption, abuses, these kinds of things. That's a reform. A revolution seeks to really uproot or to replace completely that which exists. And in Luther's writings, he wasn't seeking really did he want to get rid of certain abuses? Sure. But he also wanted to get rid of the papacy, of, the sacraments, many of them, of, everything many things that were specifically Catholic, and replace it with something different. That's not a reform, that's a revolution. And interestingly enough, if you kind of pull the thread on this topic a little bit more, you got me on my soapbox now. But, there were even Protestant historians, even biographers of Luther themselves, who also criticized that use of the term Protestant Reformation, And they argue that it absolutely was not a reform. He wasn't seeking to reform anything. He was seeking to replace the church with something completely different from the Catholic Church. And that's not reform, that's revolution. And so they don't go so far necessarily as to say, the Protestant Reformation should not be called that, should be called the Protestant Revolution. But they definitely say it was a revolt and should be kind of seen that way and not continue to use that term. Just like I always criticize Catholics who say it was the Catholic Counter-Reformation that came with Trent and whatnot. I hate that term too. Again, you got me on my soapbox and one of my pet peeves. But I always say it's the Catholic Reformation because, again, if we're arguing, as I am, that what came before it was not a reform, that it was a revolution or a movement, if we want to be neutral about it. But if it was a revolution, then the church didn't counter any reform because there was no reform that came about beforehand, right? Instead, there was an authentic Catholic reform that came about. And that actually even began before Luther wrote anything, right? In the 15th century, in the 1400s, there were Catholics throughout Christendom in certain areas, especially lay Catholics, who recognized there were problems in the church and undertook reform at their lower level, at their own diocesan and individual and parish kind of level, and lived that out authentically. It was the episcopacy and the hierarchy that took a little bit of time, but to kind of recognize that these things needed to change, because there was vested interests from their perspective to not change things. So, human nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of using different names, do you have another name to use in place of the Enlightenment?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, one of my professors in grad school used to call it the Endarkenment. So I thought, I'm not certain that's a little more difficult to say than the Enlightenment. That's I'll have to ponder that in more detail though. I probably should come up with a different name for it because there wasn't a whole lot of there was light shed on different things during that time. We can put it that way.
I love that. Okay, I think that was all of the topics I really wanted to get into. Everything you discuss was super great, but that's only hitting the surface. So if you guys want to get deeper into these topics and plenty of other ones, you even go into sort of modern age with Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Pius XII. So if you are looking for a book that goes through some of these controversial figures throughout church history and explains why the history has been misconstrued and misrepresented modernly, please check out Steve's book. And his other books too, because they're phenomenal and super accessible for the average person like me who didn't get a degree in history but still wants to learn how to defend the faith, to many anti-Catholic secularists who want to attack the faith constantly. So, Steve, is there anything else you wanted to maybe add or say about your book?
No, just, I hope people enjoy it. I tried to present these 12 Catholic heroes, if you will. Again, not saints, people who just lived their lives but have been maligned in history, especially Marie Antoinette, who's features on the cover of the book as someone who was a good Catholic individual who loved the church, loved the faith, who was maligned and canceled even within her own lifetime in scapegoating. And so I think it's important for us to not just delve or to put people into boxes and to keep them as caricatures, but rather to truly understand them as people and see them as the complex human beings they were, and to see them from a Catholic perspective, and perhaps develop a different understanding that we've been given of who these people were. And I think that's not only applicable for historical figures, but it's also applicable just in our daily life. And I think by doing that, that will help us grow deeper as Catholics and Christians as well, in how we treat other people and live our faith in the modern world, because we're called to be beacons of light to others, beacons of hope to others. That's our baptismal vocational call as Christians to do so, and we can't do that if we don't know our history and if we don't have a relationship with Christ and His church. So,
beautifully said. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. Feel free to check out my socials, Catholic Converts, on Spotify, TikTok, Instagram, Patreon, and check out Steve's books as well, which you can find anywhere online, I'm sure, right?
Yes.
So, all right, thank you so much, Steve, for joining me.